5. In our timeline, this day is marked by Emperor Hirohito's radio broadcast announcing Japan's surrender, a moment of global jubilation and relief. But in this alternate history, the war takes a final, terrifying turn. As the world prepares for peace, a top-secret encoded message flashes from the Kremlin to the headquarters of the Soviet Far Eastern Command. The order, signed by Joseph Stalin himself, is one of such profound audacity and strategic recklessness that his own generals initially believe it to be a deception. Prepare and execute an immediate invasion of the American territory of Alaska, specifically the Aleutian Islands and the mainland around Dutch Harbor. This is not the action of a rational actor, but the desperate, paranoid gambit of a dictator at the pinnacle of his power, seeing shadows of betrayal where none yet exist, and seeking to reshape the post-war world in a single, brutal stroke. To understand this unthinkable order, one must step into the paranoid mind of Joseph Stalin in the summer of 1945. The Soviet Union stands triumphant. The Red Army has obliterated the Wehrmacht. Its tanks sit astride half of Europe, and it has just launched a devastating, successful invasion of Japanese-occupied Manchuria. Yet, Stalin feels more vulnerable than ever. The successful atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki has not filled him with relief, but with a cold, existential dread. He sees the United States not as a weary ally, but as a future adversary possessing a weapon that can nullify his hard-won conventional superiority. The post-war planning at Potsdam has convinced him that the Americans and British intend to freeze him out of the true spoils of victory. In this mindset, Alaska transforms in his strategic vision. It is no longer a frozen, distant territory, but a dagger pointed at the Soviet Far East, a potential base for American nuclear bombers that could strike the industrial heartland of Siberia with impunity. His logic is one of preemption. Sees a strategic buffer and a bargaining chip before the peace solidifies against him. The military rationale, on the surface, is paper-thin, which is why it must be framed by political necessity. The official casus belli, concocted by the NKVD and Soviet propagandists, would be a fabricated incident. Perhaps a staged attack on a Soviet patrol vessel by American-backed Japanese holdouts in the Aleutians, or false intelligence alleging that the United States is harboring Japanese war criminals and military units in Alaska who are preparing to continue the war. The goal is to create just enough confusion and plausible deniability to present the invasion not as an act of war against the United States, but as a necessary extension of our Manchurian operation to fully disarm the Japanese militarist threat. It is a flimsy pretext, but Stalin calculates that a stunned America, war-weary and in the first hours of victory over Japan, will be slow to react and potentially open to negotiation rather than all-out war. The strategic objectives of the invasion are a blend of the grandiose and the pragmatic. The primary goal is the seizure of the Aleutian Islands, particularly the U.S. naval base at Dutch Harbor on Unalaska Island. This would give the Soviet Pacific Fleet a vital foothold in the North Pacific and control over key sea lanes. A secondary, more ambitious goal would be a landing on the Alaskan mainland, perhaps near Nome, to establish a defensive perimeter on the North American continent. Stalin knows he cannot conquer and hold the entirety of Alaska. His aim is a limited, shocking land grab to present the world with a fait accompli. He believes that by the time the United States can muster a coherent response, Soviet troops will be dug in on American soil. This, he calculates, would give him immense leverage in the subsequent peace talks. He could offer to withdraw from Alaska in exchange for American concessions in Europe, a unified, neutral Germany under Soviet influence, or the prevention of a permanent American military presence in Western Europe. The forces allocated for this operation, dubbed Operatia Polyarnaya Zvezda, Operation Polar Star, are a testament to its immense risk. The Soviet Far Eastern Front, fresh from its victory in Manchuria, would provide the core infantry and armored units. The Soviet Pacific Fleet, though small, will be tasked with transporting the invasion force, protected by every available submarine and aircraft. The newly formed Soviet Arctic warfare divisions, trained for the harsh conditions of the North, would be at the spearhead. But the entire plan is a logistical house of cards. Soviet naval logistics are primitive compared to the Americans. They lack dedicated landing craft, and their air cover would be stretched to its absolute limit. The commanders on the ground, veterans of the brutal Eastern Front, are aghast. They see the plan for what it is, a suicide mission against a nation whose industrial and naval power is at its zenith. As the order is disseminated down the chain of command, a chilling realization sets in among the Soviet general staff. The Great Patriotic War against the Nazis is over. But Stalin, in his paranoia and ambition, is deliberately starting a new one. The target is no longer the shattered remnants of the Axis, but their former ally, the United States of America. The unthinkable order has been given. The gears of the Red Army, still warm from the fires of Berlin and Manchuria, begin to grind northward toward the icy waters of the Bering Sea and a confrontation that would plunge the world, moments after finding peace, back into the abyss of World War. The initial Soviet landings on the Aleutian Islands in late August 1945 were not the triumphant raising of the hammer and sickle on American soil that Stalin had envisioned. Instead, they were the beginning of an operational and logistical catastrophe that would come to be known to the surviving Soviet soldiers as Polyarny Koshmar, the Polar Nightmare. Codenamed Operation Polustanok, Operation Foothold, by a hopeful Stavka, the invasion immediately collided with the brutal, unyielding realities of Alaskan geography, American defensive preparation, and the sheer mechanical might of a United States military operating on its own doorstep. The Arctic, not the American soldier, became the Red Army's most immediate and merciless enemy. The invasion fleet, a hastily assembled collection of transports, aging warships, and requisitioned civilian vessels, approached the Aleutians under the cover of the region's characteristic dense fog. Their primary objective was the capture of a U.S. naval and air base at Dutch Harbor on Unalaska Island, the strategic key to the Aleutians. The Soviets possessed a core of battle-hardened veterans from the European and Manchurian campaigns, but nothing in their experience had prepared them for the Aleutians. The islands were a desolate, volcanic landscape of treeless, windswept tundra, razor-sharp ridges, and perpetually soggy ground. The weather was a weapon in itself. Frigid winds, horizontal rain, and sudden, dense fog banks that could reduce visibility to zero in minutes, negating any numerical advantage. The landings themselves were a lesson in amphibious incompetence. The Soviet Union had never developed a dedicated landing craft capability akin to the American LSTs or LCIs. Troops were forced to disembark from transports into small, vulnerable boats, often miles from shore, and then navigate treacherous, rocky coastlines in freezing water. Many boats foundered on unseen rocks or were swamped by the choppy, icy seas. Those who made it ashore were often separated from their units, their heavy equipment lost to the depths, and their uniforms soaked, leading to the first cases of hypothermia within hours. The initial beachheads were not secure perimeters, but scattered, disorganized clusters of shivering, desperate men. They were met not by a panicked and unprepared garrison, but by a hardened and waiting American defense. The United States had fought the Japanese for control of the Aleutians in 1943, and the lessons of Attu and Kiska were fresh in the military's mind. Dutch Harbor was a fortress, its defenses significantly strengthened since the 1942 Japanese air raid. Well-camouflaged coastal artillery batteries, pre-sighted on all possible landing beaches, opened up with devastating accuracy. American P-38 Lightning and P-51 Mustang fighters, operating from a network of all-weather airstrips, tore into the vulnerable Soviet transport fleet and strafed the landing zones. The fog, which the Soviets had relied upon for concealment, now became a deadly liability, preventing their own air cover from providing support and allowing American aircraft to appear and disappear like ghosts. On the ground, the fighting was a savage throwback to the worst of the Pacific theater. The American defenders, a mix of Army infantry and hardened Marine units, did not attempt to hold the beaches. They fell back to pre-prepared defensive lines on the high ground, forcing the Soviets to attack uphill across open, boggy terrain into interlocking fields of machine gun and mortar fire. The Soviet advantage in numbers and heavy armor was neutralized by the landscape. Tanks bogged down in the soft tundra, becoming immobile targets for American bazooka teams and airstrikes. The Red Army's doctrine, built for the vast plains of Europe, was useless in this labyrinth of ravines and ridges. Attacks devolved into costly, frontal assaults against entrenched positions, a grim repetition of the meat grinder tactics of the First World War. Logistically, Operation Palustanak was a complete failure from day one. The Soviet supply lines, stretching thousands of miles from Petropavlovsk-Kamchatsky, were tenuous at best. American submarines and aircraft, operating with impunity, began a relentless campaign of interdiction, sinking supply ships with terrifying efficiency. The soldiers ashore quickly ran low on ammunition, food, and most critically, fuel for their few operational vehicles and generators. Medical supplies were almost non-existent. The wounded, if they could be evacuated from the front lines at all, often died of exposure or infection in field hospitals that were little more than holes in the ground covered with tarps. Radio communications, vital for coordinating the disparate Soviet units, failed constantly in the harsh atmospheric conditions. Within 2 weeks, the Soviet foothold was a besieged pocket of misery. The invaders held a few square miles of barren, shell-cratered real estate around their landing sites, but they controlled nothing of strategic value. Dutch Harbor remained firmly in American hands, its airstrips launching continuous sorties against them. The Soviet troops, who had faced the Wehrmacht at Stalingrad and Kursk, found a new kind of hell in Alaska. It was a war not just against a determined enemy, but against the very elements. Frostbite, trench foot, and disease ravaged the ranks as morale plummeted. The polar nightmare was not a battle for glory or ideology. It was a desperate struggle for survival, a costly and humiliating demonstration that the Red Army, for all its might, had reached its geographical and logistical limit at the doorstep of an awakened American giant. While the Red Army's infantry bled and froze in the Alaskan mud, a far more decisive battle was unfolding at sea. The Soviet invasion fleet, having delivered its grim cargo to the shores of the Aleutians, now found itself trapped in a maritime killing zone of the U.S. Navy's making. The American response to the invasion was not one of panic, but of cold, calculated execution. For years, the U.S. Navy had war-gamed the defense of the Pacific approaches, and the Aleutians, while remote, were a known strategic vector. The Soviet thrust into this region was not a masterstroke. It was a fatal blunder that played directly into the hands of the most powerful naval force ever assembled. Operation Palustanak was about to be crushed on the anvil of American sea power. The initial American shock and disbelief at the Soviet attack evaporated within hours, replaced by a surge of national fury and a flawless mobilization. The same industrial military machine that had crushed the Imperial Japanese Navy was now unleashed upon the Soviet Pacific Fleet. The U.S. Third Fleet, under the command of the legendary Admiral William Bull Halsey, was immediately ordered north from Japanese waters. Elements of the Seventh Fleet began to converge from the Central Pacific. From Puget Sound and San Diego, a massive armada of warships, fast carrier task forces, battleships, cruisers, and destroyer screens steamed toward the Bering Sea. The United States enjoyed near-total naval supremacy, and it intended to demonstrate it with overwhelming force. The geography of the North Pacific became the Americans' greatest ally. The Soviet invasion fleet, having unloaded its troops, was caught in a vice. To the south, the deep, open ocean was dominated by Halsey's carrier groups. To the north lay the ice-choked Bering Strait, a navigational death trap for deep-draft vessels. The Soviet supply line back to Petropavlovsk was a single, vulnerable thread across hundreds of miles of open water. The U.S. Navy's strategy was simple: seal the exits and systematically destroy everything afloat flying the Soviet flag. American submarines, the the silent veterans of the Pacific War were the first to arrive. They established patrol lines across the likely Soviet withdrawal routes, turning the sea lanes into ambush alleys. The ensuing naval engagements were less battles and more a turkey shoot. The Soviet Pacific Fleet was a coastal defense force, utterly outclassed in every metric. Its largest surface combatants were a handful of aging cruisers and destroyers from the pre-war era, which were swiftly hunted down by American battleship divisions and naval air power. The core of the Soviet fleet, its submarine force, was neutralized by American destroyer escorts employing the hard-won anti-submarine warfare (ASW) tactic perfected against the U-boats in the Atlantic and the Japanese in the Pacific. The Soviet submarines, designed for short-range operations in the Baltic and Black Seas, were ill-suited for the vast, stormy expanses of the North Pacific and were detected and sunk with grim efficiency. The true demonstration of American dominance came from the air. The fast carrier task forces, centered on Essex-class carriers like the USS Essex and Yorktown, launched wave after wave of Hellcat and Corsair fighters, Helldiver dive bombers, and Avenger torpedo bombers. These aircraft, flown by the most experienced naval aviators in the world, owned the skies. They found the slow-moving Soviet transport ships and their escorts and subjected them to a relentless aerial bombardment. Without adequate air cover of their own, the Soviet Air Force had no carriers and its land-based fighters lacked the range. The Soviet vessels were sitting ducks. The sea around the Aleutians became a graveyard of burning, sinking ships. Columns of thick, black smoke marked the funeral pyres of the entire Soviet logistical tale. Troop transports, ammunition ships, and oilers were sent to the bottom, taking with them any hope of reinforcement or resupply for the stranded Soviet soldiers ashore. This naval annihilation had an immediate and catastrophic effect on the land campaign. The Soviet divisions on the Aleutians were now completely isolated. The steady trickle of supplies that had been getting through ceased entirely. Ammunition stocks dwindled to nothing. Food became so scarce that soldiers were reduced to scavenging for raw shellfish and whatever rations they could salvage from the wreckage of their landing craft. Medical evacuations were impossible. The wounded, who might have been saved, now faced certain death from infection or exposure. Morale, already low, collapsed. The Red Army soldiers, who had endured the horrors of the Eastern Front, found a new kind of despair in this Arctic isolation. They were not just defeated. They were abandoned, left to wither on the vine by a navy that had been utterly destroyed. The Aleutian anvil had sprung shut with devastating finality. The U.S. Navy had not merely defeated the Soviet fleet, it had annihilated it as a fighting force, ensuring that Operation Palustenok would have no second act. The invasion was strangled in its cradle, its lifeblood of supplies and reinforcements cut off at sea. The remaining Soviet soldiers on the islands were no longer an invasion force. They were prisoners of war in the making, trapped on a barren, hostile landscape, their fate sealed not by American infantry, but by the awesome, distant power of American battleships and aircraft carriers. The message to the Kremlin was unequivocal. Any war with the United States would be a contest it could not possibly win at sea. And without control of the sea, any overseas adventure was doomed to a swift and bloody end. The Soviet invasion of Alaska, intended as a limited, shocking gambit, rapidly metastasized into a strategic cancer that consumed the very vitality of the Red Army. Just months after celebrating its hard-won victory over the Wehrmacht, the Soviet military found itself bled white on a new, unforgiving front thousands of miles from its supply bases. The Alaskan campaign became the Third Front, a quagmire that siphoned off irreplaceable manpower, devoured precious material reserves, and shattered the morale of the world's most battle-hardened army, ultimately breaking its back before the new conflict had even reached its first winter. The most immediate and catastrophic drain was on the Red Army's elite personnel. The units committed to Operation Palustenok were not fresh conscripts. They were the spearhead of the Soviet Far Eastern Front, veterans of the devastatingly successful Manchurian offensive against Japan's Guangdong Army. These were experienced junior officers, battle-hardened sergeants, and specialized troops, the institutional knowledge and fighting backbone of the entire Soviet military. In the Aleutians, they were being systematically destroyed. They died not in grand, decisive tank battles, but in futile, piecemeal infantry assaults against entrenched American positions, claimed by hypothermia in waterlogged trenches, or picked off by American snipers on the barren tundra. Each day, the Soviet Union was losing hundreds of its best soldiers, the very men who would be essential for training the next generation of troops or for the looming confrontation in Europe. This loss of veteran leadership created a vacuum that could not be filled, permanently degrading the quality of the entire Soviet officer corps. Simultaneously, the logistical demands of the Alaskan front placed an impossible strain on the Soviet war economy, which was already on the brink of collapse after 4 years of total war against Germany. The entire industrial and transportation apparatus of the Soviet Far East was now singularly focused on sustaining the unsustainably long supply line to Alaska. Factories that should have been shifting to civilian production were instead manufacturing Arctic gear, ammunition, and replacement parts for the campaign. The Trans-Siberian Railway, the vital artery of the Far East, was choked with military traffic destined for a lost cause. Every train car loaded with winter coats and artillery shells for Alaska was a train car not carrying food to the starving cities of European Russia or machinery to rebuild shattered industries. The Soviet economy, which had performed miracles to defeat Hitler, was being driven into the ground for a venture with no prospect of success. This diversion of resources had a direct and devastating impact on the Soviet position in Europe, the true center of gravity of the emerging Cold War. The millions of Red Army soldiers occupying Eastern Europe and Eastern Germany were suddenly left stranded. Their supplies of food, fuel, and ammunition were drastically curtailed as priority was given to the Alaskan disaster. The mighty tank armies that had terrified the West began to stagnate. Vehicles couldn't move for lack of fuel. Troops saw their rations cut. The Soviet occupation, which relied on the implicit threat of overwhelming force, was suddenly exposed as a paper bear. This strategic weakening did not go unnoticed in Washington and London. The American response in Europe became bolder, more assertive. The idea of rolling back Soviet gains, which seemed fanciful in August 1945, now appeared as a tangible possibility. The Alaska invasion had effectively disarmed the Soviet Union in Europe without a single shot being fired there. Perhaps the most profound damage was to the psychological core of the Red Army, its morale. For 4 years, Soviet propaganda had cultivated an image of the Red Army as an unstoppable, liberating force that had vanquished the fascist beast. Now, those same victorious soldiers were being fed into a meat grinder against their recent allies for reasons they did not understand, in a land that seemed utterly alien and hostile. Letters from the front, or the terrifying stories told by the handful of wounded who were evacuated before the naval blockade was complete, spread disillusionment through the ranks. The Frontoviki, the veteran soldiers who had survived the entire Great Patriotic War, began to ask a dangerous question. Why were they dying in Alaska? The absolute faith in the high command, already strained by the war's immense sacrifices, began to crack. Mutinies, while small and isolated, began to occur. More common was a sullen passive resistance, a refusal to follow orders with the same fervor that had characterized the drive to Berlin. By the late autumn of 1945, the Third Front had achieved the impossible. It had broken the will and capability of the Red Army. The force that stood as the guardian of the Soviet Empire was a hollow shell. It was exhausted, undersupplied, strategically overextended, and plagued by doubt. The invasion of Alaska, meant to secure the Soviet Union's future, had instead bankrupted it. It had consumed its best men, bankrupted its economy, weakened its grip on its essential European sphere, and broken the fighting spirit of its soldiers. The Red Army that faced the prospect of a prolonged global conflict with the United States was not the triumphant force of May 1945. It was a battered, bled out, and demoralized institution, its back broken on the frozen anvil of the Aleutian Islands. By October 1945, the world found itself in a state of suspended, terrifying animation. The war against Japan was officially over, yet a new, undeclared war between yesterday's allies was raging in the frigid waters and on the windswept islands of the North Pacific. The Soviet invasion force in Alaska was isolated, starving, and being systematically destroyed, while the Red Army in Europe was visibly atrophying from logistical neglect. In Washington, President Harry Truman and his advisors faced a dilemma unprecedented in history. They possessed overwhelming conventional superiority and had just demonstrated the utter futility of challenging American power in the hemisphere. Yet, a protracted conflict with the Soviet Union, even a victorious one, promised years of brutal warfare and millions of casualties. It was in this context of supreme advantage and a desire for a decisive conclusion that the United States made the fateful decision to deploy its ultimate weapon not to end a war with a fascist enemy, but to prevent a long war with a communist one. The nuclear ultimatum was about to be delivered. The strategic calculus in the White House was stark. The United States held every card. The U.S. Navy ruled the seas, the U.S. Army Air Forces dominated the skies, and the American industrial base was untouched and operating at full wartime capacity. On the ground in Alaska, American forces were preparing for a final offensive to crush the remaining Soviet pockets of resistance. However, intelligence reports also indicated that the Soviets, though bloodied, were digging in for a long war. There were concerns that Stalin might attempt a desperate lunge elsewhere, perhaps in Iran, Turkey, or a final push in Germany, to regain the initiative. A protracted, global confrontation would be costly. The atomic bomb, by contrast, offered a way to achieve a total, immediate victory without the need to invade the Soviet homeland. It was a tool of psychological and political coercion, designed to shatter the Soviet will to continue the fight. The target selection for this demonstration was a subject of intense and grim debate. It could not be a major Soviet city like Moscow or Leningrad. Such an attack would be an act of annihilation, not a warning, and would likely galvanize Soviet resistance rather than break it. Instead, the target needed to be of high strategic value to the Soviet war effort, remote enough to limit catastrophic civilian casualties, but significant enough to prove the bomb's destructive power and America's willingness to use it. The chosen target was Vladivostok. As the primary naval base and logistical hub for the entire Soviet Far East, it was the heart that pumped blood to the dying Alaskan front. Its destruction would have immediate military relevance, severing the already crippled supply lines completely and demonstrating to Stalin that the United States could, at will, eradicate the centers of his power in Asia. The delivery of the ultimatum was a masterpiece of Cold War theater. A single, encoded message was sent through neutral Swiss channels to the Kremlin. It was not a document for negotiation. It presented a simple, brutal choice. The message outlined the hopelessness of the Soviet position, the destruction of the Pacific Fleet, the encirclement of their forces in Alaska, and the strategic paralysis of their army in Europe. It then stated that the United States, in possession of atomic weapons, would use one to destroy the military infrastructure of Vladivostok in 72 hours unless the following terms were met: the immediate and unconditional surrender of all Soviet forces in Alaska, the full withdrawal of the Red Army to the pre-1939 borders of the Soviet Union, effectively relinquishing all gains from the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact and the war itself, and the submission of the Soviet government to a comprehensive program of disarmament and international inspection. The reaction in the Kremlin was one of stunned, silent horror. Stalin, the master of brutal realpolitik, was now on the receiving end of an offer he could not refuse. His military advisors presented him with the undeniable facts. The Far Eastern Front was in disarray, the Navy was gone, and the army in Europe was weakening by the day. They had no defense against the atomic bomb. The espionage efforts that had given them details about the Manhattan Project had also confirmed its terrifying power. To refuse meant the certain destruction of Vladivostok and likely other cities thereafter, coupled with a conventional American assault that his forces could no longer hope to repel. The gamble in Alaska had failed catastrophically, and the bill had come due. On the third day, as the world held its breath, the Soviet news agency TASS broadcast a somber announcement. The Soviet Union, in the interest of preserving global peace and preventing further bloodshed, accepted the American terms. The broadcast made no mention of the atomic ultimatum, framing the decision as a magnanimous act of statesmanship. In reality, it was an unconditional surrender in all but name. The Great Patriotic War, which had ended in triumph just months before, was now concluded in humiliating defeat. Soviet forces in Alaska laid down their arms, their surviving soldiers marching into American captivity. In Europe, the long, grinding process of a full Red Army withdrawal began, a retreat that would unravel the Soviet Empire before it had even been fully consolidated. World War II ended not with the defeat of Japan in August, but with the capitulation of the Soviet Union in October 1945. The United States stood alone as the undisputed global hegemon, having defeated all challengers. The nuclear ultimatum had achieved what years of conventional warfare might not have: a clean, decisive end to the emerging Cold War before it could truly begin. But this victory came at a terrible moral price. The atomic bomb was no longer a weapon of last resort against a fanatical enemy. It was now established as an instrument of diplomatic coercion, a precedent that would cast a long and ominous shadow over the New World Order. The United States had won everything, but in doing so, it had normalized the threat of nuclear annihilation as a tool of statecraft. The surrender of the Soviet Union in the autumn of 1945 did not bring about a lasting peace, but rather a peace of the victor, imposed and deeply resented. The world that emerged from the brief, bloody Alaskan War was structurally different from the one we know. There was no prolonged Cold War of ideological competition and proxy conflicts. Instead, there was a swift, decisive victory for the West that created a volatile and unstable global hierarchy. The legacy of the Soviet invasion of Alaska was not a divided Germany, but a frozen curtain of American hegemony, a world living under the permanent, watchful eye of a nuclear-armed superpower that had proven its willingness to use ultimate force to dictate terms. The consequences of those few weeks of fighting in the Arctic would shape the next half-century, creating a tense, unipolar world fraught with its own unique dangers. The most immediate and visible consequence was the radical redrawing of the map of Eurasia. The terms of the American ultimatum were enforced with relentless rigor. The Red Army was forced to withdraw not just from Eastern Europe, but from the Baltic states, eastern Poland, and parts of Finland it had annexed in 1940. The Soviet Empire was rolled back to its pre-1939 borders. Without the Red Army's presence, the nations of Eastern Europe did not fall behind an iron curtain. Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and the Balkans emerged as neutral, though deeply traumatized, states, their political futures uncertain but free from immediate Soviet domination. Germany was unified by the end of the 1940s, not as a product of diplomatic negotiation, but as a direct consequence of the Soviet collapse. The entire geopolitical architecture of Europe was shifted westward, with the United States as its undisputed guarantor. The Soviet Union itself was transformed from a global superpower into a wounded, paranoid rump state. Forced into unilateral disarmament and subjected to humiliating international inspections, it descended into economic stagnation and political isolation. The myth of the communist state's inevitability was shattered. Stalin's regime, utterly discredited by the Alaskan disaster, became increasingly brutal internally but impotent externally. The Communist International, once a tool of global subversion, lost all its credibility. Instead of a bipolar world, there was a unipolar one, with the United States holding unprecedented power. The United Nations, formed in this new context, was not a forum for superpower debate, but an instrument of American foreign policy, its Security Council permanently skewed in Washington's favor. This American hegemony, however, bred its own form of resistance and instability. While there was no rival superpower, The world became a patchwork of simmering resentments and regional conflicts that the U.S. was now obligated to manage alone. In this timeline, there is no Soviet counterweight to American intervention. The Korean War, if it occurs, is a swift, conventional American victory, leading to a unified, pro-Western Korea. The Vietnam War never happens, as there is no Soviet or Chinese support for Ho Chi Minh. However, this also means that anti-colonial and nationalist movements around the world often morph into anti-American movements, seeing the U.S. as the new imperial master. The global South becomes a complex chessboard where the United States must constantly intervene to maintain its order, without the convenient excuse of containing communism. The psychological and military legacy was the permanent normalization of nuclear first use. The Alaska precedent was established. The United States had used the atomic bomb not in response to an attack, but to compel an adversary surrender in a conventional conflict. This fundamentally altered global strategic doctrine. Every subsequent adversary of the United States, from regional dictators to insurgent groups, would operate under the shadow of this knowledge. The American nuclear arsenal was not a deterrent. It was a sledgehammer. This led to a frantic, clandestine nuclear proliferation as other nations, terrified of American unilateralism, sought their own deterrent at any cost. Britain, France, and likely a rearming Germany would accelerate their nuclear programs. The nuclear genie was not just out of the bottle. It was now a standard piece on the global chessboard. Alaska itself was transformed from a remote territory into the symbolic fortress of American global power. It became the most militarized place on Earth. Vast air bases, housing the new strategic bomber force, were constructed. Early warning radar networks, the first line of defense against any future intercontinental threat, crisscrossed the territory. The Aleutian Islands, the site of the invasion, were turned into a chain of unsinkable aircraft carriers and missile installations, a permanent, armed sentinel facing Asia. The frozen curtain was not an ideological divide, but a literal, militarized frontier, a constant reminder of the war that had briefly flared and the absolute victory that had been won. The legacy of the Alaskan War was a paradoxical piece. It was a world without the constant, hair-trigger tension of a bipolar Cold War, but also a world without balance. It was a Pax Americana, enforced by the threat of instant nuclear annihilation. The Soviet invasion of Alaska, a desperate gamble that lasted only weeks, had inadvertently created an American century more absolute and more intimidating than anyone could have imagined. The world was frozen not in a standoff between equals, but in the awe and fear of a single, victorious power, its authority cemented in the permafrost of the Aleutians and the radioactive ruins of Vladivostok. It was a quieter world, perhaps, but one living permanently in the long, dark shadow cast by a single, decisive mushroom cloud.